The current financial system is a huge fraud. And in case you didn't already know, you are constantly being robbed without realizing it. And that's why you work more and more and money doesn't seem to come in proportion to the energy and time you spend working. I'm Carol, and in this video I'm going to prove you how the financial system was created to be the biggest scam in history. Most people are still asleep thinking it's a lie, that it's a conspiracy, while they suffer passively without having any idea what's really happening. By the time most people realize it, it will be too late. To understand how and why the financial system is a huge fraud, you need to understand how it emerged and evolved into the huge scam it is today. So first, let's understand how fiat fraud was spread throughout the world, and at the end I will also show how you can protect yourself better. The global financial system is supported by a single economy, the United States of America. So the dollar and the monetary policies of US. The United States has the exorbitant privilege of being the country that prints the currency and determines the monetary policies that the entire world uses and follows. The US only achieved this privileged position because it relied on the gold to gain global trust. Gold is ancient store of value used by the Roman Empire, by Egyptians, Persians, and all the ancient civilizations. Before the dollar, gold was the global monetary standard, the money that the entire world used for payments and to store wealth. Gold reached this position because of the important monetary properties it had. Gold is scarce, difficult to produce, difficult to counterfeit, it's portable, divisible, and lasts an eternity without spoiling. There is no way to create gold from nothing. You can only discover and explore new deposits. Anything else besides gold that was money in the past spoiled, rusted, and was not durable and was not as scarce as gold. Other products and metals are easier to reproduce than gold. These ideal properties that have made gold money for millennia. Over time, a small amount of gold absorbed value and began to represent enormous fortunes. It was monetized and became the main store of global value and the monetary standard of past centuries. The gold standard brought efficiency. All prices could be represented in a constant because it allowed coining, transforming a piece of metal into a coin, with a shape, a location, and a stamped value, which made exchange much easier. It was from the coinage and monopolization of the manipulation of gold as money by empires that the first banks emerged. Modern banks are reflections of the banks of 400 years ago, in which to attract more gold coins for themselves, bankers began paying interest to customers on the coins stored in their vaults. They also noticed that not everyone redeemed the coins at the same time. That's when they discovered that it's okay to have less gold in the vaults than customers had deposited. Banks in the past realized that if you deposited 30 gold coins and received 1 coin per month as interest, you would deposit more gold in the bank. If 4 more people do the same, the bank would then have 150 coins stored in its reserves at the end of the month. In other words, the promise of interest attracts more money to the bank and shifts people's wealth to these intermediaries. These are the beginnings of the fiat mentality of getting rid of something valuable to receive a reward smaller than the total amount you have. The problem is that instead of using its own gold to pay the interest promised to customers, the bank used gold coins from other customers who deposited it on its reserves. This way, the bank attracts more coins, and it's fortunate that all customers will want to withdraw their coins at the same time. If this happened, the bank would fail, and it was from this time that the term bankruptcy emerged. Bankers traded gold at their tables, and when they went bankrupt, their tables were generally broken. Bankrupt. The banks that survived to this period decided to innovate and create contracts that guaranteed that if the person decided to redeem their money, they would have the gold coins back. These contracts shrank and became the paper money notes that still exist today, with the difference that today you cannot redeem dollars for gold. The ancient note represented by a contract, a promise to pay the bearer in gold coins. Realize that the true wealth was not the paper, the contract, but on the gold coins that were left in the bank. Being a bank has become very profitable. It attracts a lot of liquidity. They popped up all over the world and started competing to do business with merchants, mainly in Venice and London. In London, the first reserve bank became the Bank of England, supported by English government in 1694. So this institutionalized and nationalized paper money. In other words, the most profitable banks became part of the state. This model was replicated in the United States with the creation of the Federal Reserve, the Fed, the American Central Bank. Like the Bank of England, the Fed was formed by 12 regional private banks at the time, which became an exclusive government bank, the central bank. So this is how the intimate relationship between governments and banks began. Central banks sprouted all over the world, and it also increased the influence of governments over the population's gold. Governments now no longer finance themselves just by forcing the payment of taxes. Now they can also print money through notes redeemable in gold. Linking the notes to real gold was what gave legitimacy to this entire operation. People saw value in paper money because it was convertible to gold. But the fraud begins precisely there, when governments needed to finance themselves to fund wars. And what was the easiest way to finance yourself, to have money? It wasn't charging taxes. After all, several riots and revolutions took place due to people refusing to pay more taxes. The easiest way for governments to fund themselves was, and it is, by printing money. Governments began to print more banknotes than they had in gold in their vaults and abuse the trust that the population gave them. But when central banks print more money, regardless of demand for goods and services, prices rise. Inflation happens. Prices rise because the value of circulating notes has been completely diluted by the creation of more notes out of thin air. In this period, after World War I, the USA realized that several countries were starting to abandon the gold standard and printed money. They realized that the country that had more gold would survive the post-war period better. So the Americans decided to confiscate the gold, the population's wealth, with Executive Decree 6102, ordering that the American people to hand over all their gold to the government. Anyone who didn't deliver would be arrested and pay a fine of $10,000, a fortune at the time. Now, in addition to trusting the American government that the money would be backed by gold, the population itself was separated from what actually guaranteed value in money. It was the first default. The Americans ended the convertibility of money into gold for the population itself. It was a huge confiscation. But the Federal Reserve obviously printed new dollars bills and removed the words redeemed in gold on the notes. Soon after the Second World War, and once again, other countries used all their gold to cover the cost of war. The United States did the opposite. It did the same thing as in the First World War, selling weapons, food, and other goods to Europe and other countries at war in exchange for gold. With the large influx of gold during the First and Second World Wars, along with the confiscation of the population's own gold, they had 70% of the world's gold reserves. The United Kingdom went from being the world's biggest creditors to the world's biggest debtor. The Americans took advantage of this position of strength to organize the Bretton Woods meeting with more than 40 countries and proposed a new banking and exchange system called Bretton Woods system. In it, the dollar would remain redeemable for gold for other countries at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. And oddly enough, it worked. Countries around the world agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar because of the gold backing that no one else had after the war. This is how the Americans played global chess. The Fed became the bank of all nations in the world, and countries had to accumulate dollars in their reserves to be able to transact in international trade. In other words, the US managed to increase the demand for dollars in the confidence that the gold backing would be maintained. The problem is that in 1970, the Americans were involved in the Vietnam War. Wars are expensive. And again, the classic. If governments can't finance themselves through taxes, what they do? They print money. The US began printing more money than it had in gold. This got the attention of the countries that were part of the Bretton Woods Agreement. They began to demand for the gold from the Americans. The Americans didn't want to hand over their gold to anyone, because it was precisely having a lot of gold that put them in the position of the main global power. Trying to prevent the exit of gold, President Nixon issued a decree established a bank holiday and ended the Bretton Woods Agreement. No country would ever get back the gold it left in the US. It was a big default. This time, no longer on the population, but on the countries that trusted the Bretton Woods Agreement. This is how the dollar and all global currencies lost their backing to gold and started the biggest fraud in our civilization: fiat money. With the end of gold backing, Americans were able to print money without having to keep gold reserves. Other countries also started to do the same, and from then on, money printing suddenly became a thing more frequent. In the last 14 years alone, the USA has printed 60% of the dollars that exist in the world today. The dollar has lost 97% of value since it was created. The reason for this devaluation is precisely the dilution, loss of value due to the unlimited creation of new circulating currencies. This is a fraud because when banks and governments create money out of thin air, they benefit and become rich through price inflation while the rest of the population becomes poor. So this is how fiat robbery happens, and it happens in two ways: through central bank printers and also through banks that can create money out of the thin air supported by central banks. And the end of the gold standard unlocked widespread fiat fraud. Remember that I commented at the beginning of the video that if all bank customers tried to withdraw their gold coins from the old banks, they would go bankrupt. Today, the same thing happens. This is what happened in March 2023, when bank runs happened in the US and banks like Silvergate, Silicon Valley, and First Republic Bank went bankrupt. Even the Credit Suisse Bank had to be bought by UBS to avoid going bankrupt. In 2008, during the global financial crisis, banks around the world didn't go bankrupt because governments rescued many of them from bankruptcy. They printed money to rescue banks because simply they had a business model that has been unsustainable for centuries. They survived to crisis thanks to the cartel between banks and governments, while smaller companies fail and have no access to credit. So this means that the system privatizes profits among the king's friends and socializes losses among the entire population who see their purchasing power being diluted. This is theft because when governments print money, they direct liquidity to banks. The banks invest this newly created money in assets. These assets appreciate in value and increase the bank's assets, while the entire population sees their purchasing power shrink. Salaries take time to be adjusted and everything becomes more expensive. So printing money is also theft because it reduces government debt and increases people's debt. Governments start to collect more taxes with rising in prices because nominally it appears that companies and workers are earning more, when in reality the cost of production has also risen. So we start to move up in the tax bracket, but the real gain is flattened by the increase in production costs. This is why governments delay and postpone tax adjustments for a long time and often never adjust them according to inflation. Because it is very convenient, they are draining the population via inflation without even increasing the tax rate, just printing money and pushing people into even higher tax levels. But it's not just governments that can print money. Banks can print money too. Banks can print money through bank credit and loan contracts. In fact, this is how most of the money in circulation is generated. Banks need money to lend to someone or themselves. They tell the central banks that they need liquidity. The central bank simply issues a debt security from the bank to the government treasury. The new balance is released to the commercial bank, and the central bank just press a button to update the system that X million new dollars were created to lend to bank X. This is money created out of the thin air via bank credit with the approval of the central bank. And it gets worse. When banks borrow newly created money from the central bank, they give bonds as collateral, and often they are titles that worth nothing. As happened during the subprime crisis, banks handed over loans to the central bank for people who were unable to afford the debt. In other words, the bank carries out a tight credit assessment, undertakes risky operations, and when things go wrong, it is rescued by the central banks at the expense of the dilution of the entire population. When governments release newly created money to banks, they only release the amount that the banks ask to lend to other people. But the interest that banks receive for lending money that was created out of the thin air by the central bank, only the amount of loan principal is actually created. But the loan has to be paid back with interest. This interest is money created from nothing. This interest paid by bank customers is new money that enters the bank as the bank's profit. This is why being a bank is extremely profitable. You take an infinite money printer without any backing, print it, and still charge others for printing money out of the thin air. This new money that also enters the economy as interest on to banks obviously also destroy everyone's purchasing power. That's why the fiat system is a very well-adjusted and camouflaged device to steal value quietly from everyone, the entire population, to benefit governments and banks. And that's why these two institutions are common ground around the world. This is how this gear always goes in the direction of inflationary collapse. After all, banks and governments do not want to leave this comfortable position. Who exposed the crime is the currency that itself is continually losing value. This effect has happened several times throughout history, but governments camouflage it by accusing business people, the climate, and everyone other than the government and banks. Inflation is inherent and perpetual part of this evil system. Prices will always go up because they will not give up on becoming richer and more powerful at the expense of the people. And that's why printing money is a crime against humanity. Printing money is a civilizational scam using institutions to protect you, but those who saved money are being robbed. It's unfair and revolting. It is the exact definition of a pyramid that benefits the creators and those who are at the top, and those who arrive later, the younger generations, are robbed even more. Okay, but how to stop this mechanism? All the money that existed in history, where governments or empires could manipulate the supply, could create more currencies out of the thin air, collapsed via inflation and hyperinflation. That's why the collapse of fiat money will happen sooner or later. It's already happening. Currencies are going to zero. Therefore, having an alternative money in which new currencies cannot be created out of the thin air and which allows the population to have property rights without being confiscated by anyone, not even governments or banks, is the way out of the Ponzi fiat. This alternative already exists. It is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is a decentralized alternative money and financial system. It cannot be monopolized like governments and banks did with gold. Bitcoin is scarce and there is no way to speed up the creation of new currencies. Only 21 million Bitcoin will be created by the year 2140. And this is the main difference between Bitcoin and the current financial system. Bitcoin is transparent, predictable, and immutable. You know all of its monetary policy in advance and you know that it is immutable, as no one can monopolize and change the system. Bitcoin brings all the monetary properties of gold but in digital format, strengthening all the monetary properties of scarcity, portability, divisibility, durability, and salability of gold. And this is why Bitcoin has appreciated so much, 6 billion% since 2009. It's the opposite of fiat money. Also, you adopt Bitcoin voluntarily because you understand and you want these properties that bring more wealth and abundance to your path, instead of holding a fiat ice cube that constantly robs you of value. Now the video is already huge, but if you want to learn more about Bitcoin, how it gets you off the fiat rat wheel, and how it can help you to build a long-term wealth, I invite you to subscribe and watch the next videos here in Area Bitcoin channel. Now that you understand that the financial system is a fraud, the choice is yours to opt out this Ponzi fiat.